Welcome back to the Truth Over Comfort show. On the video today, we're going to be discussing a document that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, the 1962 Operation Northwoods document. You might have heard the name, or you might have read it, or read parts of it, or just heard it in the culture, or even from Joe Rogan, who actually brings it up a fair amount, which is good to see. So, what's so crazy about this is obviously they are trying to whip up public opinion and international opinion by committing false flag events to artificially justify invading Cuba. They can't invade them just because they're communist or they're friendly with the Soviet Union because they're near. They talk about in this document, as frank as they come, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest order of the military, that they need to provide justification to invade Cuba. So they come up with all these crazy scenarios that most people think false flag terrorism is a conspiracy theory. Or you might have heard it recently when the US said Russia was going to use false flag event to provide justification the war in Ukraine, as if it's new and it's weird. They even actually discussed it. They're actually letting people know that's a thing. You can look up Operation Himmler, where the Nazis used it as a pretext to invade Poland. But this is not a made-up thing. You can read it in this document, and I'm going to read a few sections. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's 15 pages, but it's 10 really, because there's lots of blank spaces. But there's some seriously nutty shit that they discuss in this. That's why there's so many. It didn't end up happening, obviously, but just the atmosphere of how they're talking about, how they even talk about the start, how we're going to assume other agencies are working on similar things, probably the CIA, and they even mentioned the State Department at the bottom. So there's just this whole project of providing justification to invade Cuba. Why would they change stuff like that now? There's plenty of opposition and not real justification for some of the countries, they want to invade. So why not whip up public opinion and international opinion by, being the victim, which is what they're trying to do in this, and they talk about pretty frankly. So what's also crazy about this is it was 1 year, 11 months actually, after the Bay of Pigs event. So they financed all these people to try and overthrow the Fidel Castro administration in 1961, and the US military with their Mr. Burns scheming hands go, yeah, don't worry, lads. Don't feel demoralized or like you failed. All right, we go back at them. We get them next game. Don't worry, we get a win eventually, and we overthrow those Cubans. Don't you worry. Like, it's just crazy. Like the brazenness of the time as well. Obviously, the US is the big boy. Again, it's the Cold War, and literally 11 months after that, they're just like, well, let's try again. And even if they do whip up, Cuba did this or invade, if people obviously believed it, no internet. But you're like, why would Cuba, this tiny country, start on the US when the US wants to invade it and clearly does? And you're like, so you tried to overthrow them before, then they, do this stuff to you, and then, we're the victim. They go in the military straight away, like, as if you didn't want that to happen. Why would Cuba want it to happen? Like, it's just crazy stuff. That's obviously just like, why would you believe it? But anyway, this is 13th of March, 1962, Operation Northwoods. Subject, straight in, no fucking about, justification for US military intervention in Cuba. Like, they ain't hiding anything from that subject. It's obviously internal, but justification for US military intervention in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have considered the attached memorandum for the Chief of Operations Cuba Project, which responds to a request of that office for brief but precise description of pretexts which would provide justification for US military intervention in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommend that the proposed memorandum be forwarded as a preliminary submission suitable for planning purposes. Make it a bit bigger. It is assumed that there will be similar submissions from other agencies and that these inputs will be used as a basis for developing a time-phrased plan. As I said, that's the culture, that's the atmosphere. Not only that they're, doing this obviously dodgy, whatever they think is right in their minds, they know it's as covert as you get, it's as dodgy you can get, framing another country of committing these acts and maybe, even killing and wounding US citizens. Also, you can militarily invade them. Like, that's as covert as you can get. And they're like, yeah, I'm sure there's other agencies working on it. Like, that's just us right now. Like, why would they not be? We're just all, one big team trying to take out the opposition. As you can see, it is signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, LL Lemanza, chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, and he was not fired. He went to be head of NATO operations. And what was going on there at the time? So they're talking about here false flag terrorism, false flag events to, provide justification to invade a country. What's going on at this time? Oh, yeah. Operation Gladio, where there was all these stay behind armies, secret, working with the intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, and NATO, to apparently, whether I can't remember, they actually confirmed, but, that they was committing false flag terrorism through these far right groups and armies to blame on the communists to, crack down. But there's all these secret armies. You can look up the European Parliament did an investigation in 1990 when it all came out after one of the Italian prime ministers mentioned Gladio. And so this guy goes to head NATO and they're like, hey, we like your creativity. Why don't we use some of that here? Because not right for this, but don't worry, you'll be rewarded for these good ideas. As you can see, Northwoods. As requested by Chief of Operations, Cuba Project, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are to indicate a brief but precise description of pretexts that they consider would provide justification for US military intervention in Cuba. It is recognized that any action which becomes pretext for US military intervention in Cuba will lead to a political decision, which will then lead to a military action. So the pretext that they're going to provide will then get obviously all the politicians speaking about it, and then obviously they will go to the military. The suggested course of action appended to enclosure A are based on the premise that the US military intervention will result from a period of heightened US-Cuban tensions, which place the United States in the position of suffering justifiable grievances. World opinion and the United Nations Forum should favorably affected by developing the international image of the Cuban government as rash and irresponsible, as an alarming and unpredictable threat to the peace of the Western Hemisphere. So what we got there? They're thinking everything through for, public opinion. It's going to be all these US-Cuban tensions because of the stuff they made up and caused themselves. This will then look like the US as the poor victim of these vicious Cuba attacks. And then opinion, which they need in the international community and the UN, well, they can do it without them, but they'd rather obviously have them on their side, as they did, in like Korea, unlike Iraq, where obviously there was even opposition from allies like France. So this is a way of doing that. And there's unpredictable threat to the Western Hemisphere. Get the Caribbean, get the other South American countries on their side, so that if we've got a coalition, maybe not of military action, but they can say, whoa, the ones that they obviously see through the bullshit, but they're like, fine, US, you've given us, a reason to support it without looking like, a US puppet or portraying another country. So they talk about a bit about obviously getting the Soviet Union involved. In that time, they had no official agreement and they weren't part of the Warsaw Pact. It is don't worry, the juicy stuff will come to you. You just got to prepare it. This is a bit about the public opinion. It is recommended that Enclosure A, together with attachments, should be forwarded to the Secretary of Defense for approval and transmittal to the Chief of Operations Cuba Project. So they've obviously got this whole project of how can we start a war with Cuba without looking like someone who's bullying a small country. So they don't want it forward to other commanders or other US officers in NATO, and definitely not to the United Nations Military Staff Committee. Don't know if that's just their thing or the whole UN thing. So we're going to skip this. So they talked about Operation Mongoose a bit, which maybe I'll do on another video. Not really touching it, just mentioning it, which is, sort of around this sort of topics. So this is where they start actually talking about what they could do. Such a plan would enable a logical build-up of incidents to be combined with other seemingly unrelated events to camouflage the ultimate objective and create the necessary impression of Cuban rashness and irresponsibility on a large scale directed at other countries as well as the United States. So they want other countries, as I said before, to feel like they're threatened. And, they want other unrelated seemingly events to camouflage, but it's all obviously part of the plan. The plan would also properly integrate and time phase the courses of action to be pursued. The desired resultant from the execution of this plan would be placed the US in the apparent position of suffering the offensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere. We want to create an international image of the Cuban threat, not just a threat to the US, but internationally. Time is an important factor in a resolution of the Cuban problem. Therefore, the plan should be time-phased that projects would operable within the next few months. Insomuch the ultimate objective is overt military intervention, I recommend that primary responsibility for the military goes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the military, I guess. Okay, so this is where they start talking about some of the stuff they can do to Cuba. Harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans of imminent invasion would be emphasized. Our military posture throughout execution of the plan will allow a rapid change from exercise to invention if response. So I think this first bit was about provoking Cuba into making another act that they can go against them, but a series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in around Guantanamo Bay to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. So again, they're thinking about this and how it needs to be perceived as legitimate. So they have to attack themselves. Instances to establish a credible attack, not in chronological order. Start rumors. Use clandestine radio. Land friendly Cubans, so allied Cubans to them, in uniform over the fence of Guantanamo to stage an attack on the base. Then capture your friends, the Cuban friends, saboteurs inside the base. Start riots near the base main gate against their friends. Blow up ammunition inside the base. Start fires. Burn aircraft on airbase. Sabotage. Lob mortar shells from outside of base into base. Some damage to installations. Capture assault team approaching from the scene of incident of Guantanamo City. Capture militia group which storms the base. Sabotage ship in harbor, large fires. Sink ship near harbor entrance. Conduct funerals for mock victims. Just think about that. When everyone goes on about crisis actors and stuff being made up, I'm not here to talk about that and stuff that's happened in the last 20 years. But there's conduct funerals for mock victims. So stage a funeral for these fake victims to look real, and plaster it probably on the TV. So there are these funerals are going on for these poor victims, people crying, all these people are going to be locked into the TV. Oh, these poor people, I can't believe those Cubans did it. It's just made up. There might not even be a real dead guy, just funeral of just an alias. The United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying artillery and mortar replacements which threaten the base. From those large-scale United States military operations, we would blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. So they're going to blow up a US ship, probably no one on it. We would blow up a drone, unmanned vessel anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to Havana or Santiago would add credibility, especially if those people that might have heard the blast or seen the fire. The US could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by US fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Okay, so there's no crew. They evacuate. There's no one there. Casualty lists in US newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Let me repeat that. So they're using the media. Casualty lists in US newspapers would cause a wave of national indignation. So using the media to whip up national indignation of, sorrow. This is, we've been attacked. Our national security is generally at risk. There's poor people who died, poor military people. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated, as in meaning there's an actual boatload of Cubans which they're going to sink and kill. So if it's simulated, it means there's no one on it, and real means there's actually, we're just gonna do it. I'm not clear, but the fact they said real or simulated means, it looks like they're willing to kill Cubans, but that's an interpretation of what that means. Have a read of it again yourself and see what you think. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the US, even to the extent of wounding an incident just to be widely publicized. So they're talking about actually wounding Cuban refugees in the US and widely publicizing it, again, to whip up public opinion and making it, actually using people to make it real, because there'd be real reaction, real people in hospitals rather than just fake funerals of A-listers. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substituting Cuban involvement also would be helpful when projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. A Cuban-based Castro-supported filibuster could be simulated against neighboring Caribbean nation. Hang on, so we know that Castro, so backing other countries, and then they're talking about shipments of arms which could be found or intercepted on the beach and going towards the Dominican Republic to scare the neighbors, basically, to get them on the US's side. Again, if I'll put this in the show notes so you can read the whole document. It's not that much. See, we're really on page 12 on the first few blank spaces. We're almost at probably the juiciest bit, and that was obviously pretty shocking. Use of MiG-type aircraft by US pilots could provide additional provocation. Harassment of civil air attacks on surface shipping and destruction of US military drones, aircraft by MiG-type planes would be useful as a complementary actions. An F-86 properly painted to convince air passengers that they saw a Cuban MiG, especially if the pilot of the transport were to announce such fact. The primary drawback of this discussion appears to be the security risk in obtaining or modifying an aircraft. However, reasonable copies of the MiG could be reduced from US resources in about 3 months. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. Concurrently, genuine defections of Cuban civil and military air and surface craft should be encouraged. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner route, so a civil, normal people, from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The destination would be chosen only to cause the flight plan route to across Cuba. It needs to go over Cuban airspace. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday, or any grouping of persons with a common interest to support chartering a non-scheduled flight. An aircraft, Eglin AFB, would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate of a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization, so a front company, in the Miami area. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. They're thinking about this pretty deeply. Timing, everything. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft will be scheduled to allow a sort of South Florida rendezvous, south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin, AFB, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the field flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone will be transmitting on the international distress frequency as Mayday. You know, in films where they're going to like, I was with Mayday, Mayday, you're going down, Mayday. With Mayday, maybe, Mayday. Message stating that is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. You know, they got a drone they can blow up in 1962 that looks like a real plane and it's unmanned and all done by radio signal. Imagine what they could do now. Think about how quick technology is advanced every 10 years. Imagine what they could do now, 60 years later. About 60 years later, bang on. That's nuts. Who knows what they got? This will allow radio stations in Western Hemisphere to tell the US what happened to the aircraft instead of the US trying to sell the incident. So instead of the US being the first on scene and be like, oh, look what's happened, you know, it's this, and we're the ones explaining, they're going to play the game where they wait, pretend it hasn't happened, and wait for the first on scene to tell them, oh my god, you know, this has happened, so they don't have to sell it. That's pretty smart. That's like, imagine you're the murderer and you're first on scene and you're like, oh, this happened, I saw that. You let the other people go because you've created a scenario where they're going to say it was that and that, and it has nothing to do with you. Pretty genius, to be honest. It's possible to create an incident which will make it appear that the communist Cuban MiG have destroyed a USAF aircraft over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Unprovoked. Approximately 4 or 5 F-01 aircraft will be dispatched to Trail Homestead, Florida, to Vicinity of Cuba. Their mission will be to reverse course and simulate for key aircraft for an air defense exercise in southern Florida. These aircraft would conduct variations of these flights at frequent intervals. Crews would be briefed to remain at least 12 miles off the Cuban coast. However, they were required to carry live ammunition in the event hostile actions were taken by the Cuban MiGs. Of one such flight, a pre-briefed pilot would fly tail end Charlie at considerable interval between aircraft. While near the Cuban island, this pilot would broadcast that he had been jumped by MiGs and was going down. No other calls would be made. The pilot would then fly directly west, extremely low altitude, and land at a secure base and Eglin or auxiliary, so no one could see him in the sky. Go really low, just above the sea. The aircraft would be met by proper people, so actual real people in this now, quickly stored and given a new tail number. The pilot who had performed the mission under an alias would resume his proper identity and return to his normal place of business. The pilot and aircraft would then have been disappeared. At precisely the same time that the aircraft was presumably shot down, a submarine or small surface craft would disperse F-01 parts, parachute, etc., approximately 15 to 20 miles off Cuban coast and depart. I don't know if they're saying like submarines going there to collect parts to get rid of evidence. Is that what they're saying? At precisely the same time that the aircraft was presumably shot down, a submarine or small surface craft would disperse F-101 parts, Oh, are they going there to plant stuff? Because it was a drone that got blown up. They're going to go there, put a parachute there, so it looks like the guys ejected themselves, and FO1 parts. I think that's what they're trying to say. The pilots returning to Homestead would have a true story as far as they knew. Search ships and aircraft would be dispatched and parts of aircraft found. So on the last page now. Facts bearing on the problem. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have previously stated that US unilateral military intervention in Cuba can be undertaken in the event the Cuban regime commits hostile acts against US forces or property, which would serve as an incident upon which to base over intervention. The need for positive action in the event that current covert efforts to foster an internal Cuban rebellion unsuccessful was indicated. So I'm not sure if they're saying they're trying to like fund elements in Cuba to overthrow it themselves, rather than them having, to overtly military invade the country. Determination that credible internal revolt is impossible of attainment during the next 9 to 10 months will require a decision by the United States to develop a Cuban provocation. Yeah, I think that's what they're saying. So if over the next 9-10 months, probably because they've just tried to, do a military action, they'd rather it internally, they would overthrow them. So it looks like homegrown seeds of revolution because they hate Castro, and then the US can quickly recognize the new government and back them, give them loads of money and their army. If that doesn't work, we're going to have to come up with some provocation as justification for positive US military action. It is understood that the Department of State Department also is preparing suggested courses of action to develop justification for US military intervention in Cuba. All right, they're all on it. But there you have it. The military speaks for itself. How in depth they've actually got this. So they've thought about public opinion, the UN, other, Caribbean countries, because Cuba's in the Caribbean, not obviously South America. What these other countries are going to think. They're going to wait, they're going to fly a jet, a civilian airliner over Cuban airspace, switch it with a drone painted exactly the same, blow it up, mayday, mayday, wait, not go first on scene, wait for it to be reported to them. Oh, guys, Cuba, this incident's happened over Cuban airspace to a civilian airliner. There's submarines gone there at the same time to drop off these parts of parachute, make it legit. The other drone is, flown at low altitude just above the sea, so no one sees it. Like, oh, that incident happened. We saw another plane fly off that looked pretty similar. And then goes back to the thing, there's actual people there and to hide it all. I probably got some of it. It's kind of confusing, some of it, because I'm interpreting what they're saying. But they've thought this out pretty well, and all just so they can provide justification to invade. They want national indignation across the US through reporting figures in the newspapers, and what was that other crazy bit? Oh yeah, mock funerals. Go heal or wound a bunch of Cuban refugees in Miami and Florida. All this crazy stuff. They, sink a ship of Cuban people, maybe simulated or real, whatever that means. I can't say for sure that means they was going to sink just a boat of Cubans and just kill them all, or they had something else in mind. I'm not sure they was going to stage it, a simulated one. But they said real or simulated. They generally say wound. They're up for wound, and when you try and wound someone, you can accidentally kill them. So, go read the document. It's not 15 pages, really. It obviously got rejected. People say Kennedy rejected it. I was trying to find like an actual source on that. Wikipedia says it, and other places. But you can see the guy actually did go and head up NATO and look up Operation Gladio. But I'll leave it there. But if anyone tells you false flag terrorism isn't real, or that they don't talk about these things, show them the section of this document and the whole thing, or just show them the subject: justification of US military intervention in Cuba, and just Control F and just keyword it and show them that it's real. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure most of you already read it. But it's an extremely important document, and I'll leave it there. Make your own mind up about some of the stuff in there, but it's nuts, whatever you think about it. But thanks for listening to the Truth Over Comfort show.